Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza, and today we're going to be talking about a new effort underway in Denver to stave off and protect tenants from a forthcoming wave of evictions. Now, Denver, like so many cities and jurisdictions across the country, finds itself heading towards what people have been calling the eviction cliff. This is a threat to basically inflame an already overwhelming homelessness crisis, further compound existing housing issues in Denver, further compound housing insecurity, wealth inequality. And this is all because people have gotten really behind on rent during the pandemic, and federal eviction moratoriums are going to end this summer. So the problems in Denver are far from unique. This is not a Denver problem. This is a U.S. problem. Across the country, millions of households have been falling farther and farther and farther behind on rent amid the COVID-19 pandemic and ensuing economic downturn. But unlike many states, Colorado's eviction moratorium actually already expired. It expired at the end of 2020. And some tenants do remain protected by the federal eviction moratorium that I mentioned earlier. That will expire in June, leaving tenants entirely without protection in Colorado. Now, even with the current small amount of protection from the federal moratorium, though, nearly 4,000 evictions were filed in Denver last year. And thousands more have already been filed across the state so far this year, and we're only in May. So that's because according to a recent federal survey, and I found this number really shocking, and you might as well, nearly 1/3 of all Colorado households are currently behind on rent. A third. So that means hundreds of thousands of renters could soon be at the mercy of their landlords, who may be eager to move forward with eviction proceedings in housing court. Now, last month, Denver City Council member Candy Sedebaca moved to meet this impending crisis with a new measure designed to provide some level of protection to renters who are facing eviction. Under her proposed ordinance, the city would provide legal representation to certain tenants during these eviction proceedings. This would be critically important because right now there is no right to counsel. There's no right to a lawyer in eviction proceedings. They take place in civil court, not criminal court. So there's no right to a lawyer if you can't afford one. Studies have shown that as few as 1% of tenants facing eviction in Denver have lawyers. 99% of people who go into this eviction proceeding do so by themselves with no lawyer by their side. But landlords are almost always represented. They almost always have lawyers. In fact, according to one study of Denver eviction filings between 2014 and 2016, literally, they hit the mark. Literally 100% of landlords in that study had legal representation. So you got a bunch of tenants who have no lawyers going up against their landlords who do have lawyers. The result is pretty much what you would expect. Without a lawyer, renters tend to get run over during legal proceedings. That means not only that they're more likely to actually get evicted and lose their homes, but they're more likely to be forced out in evictions carried out by the sheriff. They're less likely to be able to negotiate a move-out date, less likely to be able to negotiate to keep the eviction off their record to help them find housing in the future, less likely to get access to rental or relocation assistance programs or apply for public housing. In other words, everything that happens when you don't have a lawyer by your side makes you less likely to be able to recover from the eviction, more likely to be evicted and less likely to be able to recover from that, increasing the chances of becoming unhoused. So while providing tenants with lawyers wouldn't necessarily halt this oncoming wave of evictions in Denver, it would at least give some of the most vulnerable renters a fighting chance to secure a slightly better outcome. Now, joining me now to discuss her new eviction defense proposal is Denver City Council member Candy Sedebaca. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me and for talking about this very, very important issue.
It's incredibly high stakes, right? I mean, home is everything. Home is where you put your kids to bed. It's where you get ready for a job interview. It's where you can stay if you're sick or in, a pandemic. So thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about this. Now, before we dive into the specifics of your proposal, I'm hoping you can give us a rundown on the current eviction landscape in Denver. I remember from last time we spoke that Denver has some kind of weird housing laws, and the situation in Denver is uniquely extreme. How many people are facing eviction right now? What does the process look like? For people who can't afford a lawyer, like what's the problem you're facing?
The numbers are pretty consistent with the statistic you mentioned earlier. I think we're at 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 Denverites are facing eviction. We had a crisis before COVID. Our housing prices, the cost of living here skyrocketed, and most people weren't able to absorb that. And so, we had a huge issue of mounting homelessness before people were out of work for months on top of months, and that was stacking up. And so now we've got a situation that is just untenable. We don't have enough shelters for the people who were on the streets before the pandemic. Now you've got more and more people falling out of that pipe into the pipeline of homelessness. If you have an eviction on your record, as you mentioned, it's exponentially more difficult to ever get housed permanently again. We are spending millions of dollars on the least effective way to house people, which is in shelters, and there's no end in sight. And so we're trying to just level out the playing field as best we can, hopefully disincentivize lawyers taking these evictions all the way to court, and encouraging them to do some of that negotiation prior to getting the court system involved. Because now when they show up, hopefully, if this gets passed, their tenants will be on a level playing field and able to negotiate with them in a way that keeps an eviction off their record permanently.
So there's all of these things I'm so glad you're mentioning, which is like people think of the eviction court decision being like eviction versus no eviction, but there's all this other stuff that makes people more likely to recover and land on their feet. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how the problem you're facing is going to change. Assuming no other changes, what would the end of the federal moratorium do to this problem in Denver?
Well, right now we saw the spike in January when it was originally expected to go away. And so that spike in filings kind of gave us a little bit of a foreshadowing of what might happen once the federal moratorium goes away. And so we're just expecting them to get filed fast and not be able to keep up with them. We have at a couple of points run out of rental assistance, which is, what landlords are leaning on. They're saying, oh, you don't need money for attorneys. They don't need money to be fighting in court. We need rental assistance. And that pot of money itself is shrinking. And so I'm expecting chaos. We're trying to equip as many community organizations as possible to be able to process rental assistance requests. But we're doing the same thing with the attorneys, trying to make sure that we've got enough attorneys to be able to represent our constituents in the 3 courtrooms where they process evictions.
So tell us about your new ordinance. How would it address the problem? What would the impact be for low-income folks who might otherwise be facing eviction alone?
Well, most people don't show up to court. Our data suggests that 75% of people don't even show up to their first date of court. And that, is the first disadvantage that they're put at. They don't know that if they show up to court that they have support there. We have an eviction legal defense program right now, but they don't know about it because you have to go to your first day of court to figure it out. And so when they show up, they'll have somebody there to fight with them, to fight and to show them what is possible. A lot of people don't want to stay in the household. They are trying to get out of the house, but they don't know that the agreements that they make come with a judgment on your record. And so the ability for them to have someone who knows what a non-judgment stipulation is, that is incredibly helpful in the long term of things. So they will at least feel supported. They won't feel that they're taking this on alone. They'll have someone who speaks the language of the law. And hopefully what we're really hoping is that landlords start to respect that tenants have rights. We know in a lot of situations where there are evictions, they're happening in an illegal fashion. They're happening against the law. And so I think that this will potentially change the face of evictions in a city like Denver, where we have a very pro landlord state. We have a rent control ban at the state level, and landlords really run things here. And I hope that that dynamic truly gets flipped.
So you're super up against the clock. I mean, this federal moratorium is expiring in June. We are in early May here. What are the chances of this right to counsel happening before, as you called it, the chaos, before the chaos arrives?
Well, my hope, I had actually initiated this back in December, and my hope was to have this done by March, when we thought the other moratorium was going to go away. And we didn't make it fast enough. A lot of what I've been doing is dotting the I's and crossing the T's, because as a minority voice on council, process is always weaponized against me. And so what we hope is that we've dotted all of the I's and crossed all of the T's in a way that's satisfactory to my council colleagues. That way we can get relief before November, because citizens have taken it upon themselves to also create a mirror ballot initiative. So if I don't get 6 votes on council, there's still an opportunity for the people to vote on this in November. I'm just hoping to bring relief sooner, and in a way that council members were able to participate in crafting it.
Yeah, was there, I believe there was a previous sort of legal defense pilot program that launched in Denver in 2018. Can you talk a little bit about how that program worked and what you learned from it, whether you're building on that or whether you're, what the lessons you took from that work?
Definitely. We actually built completely on top of that pilot program. The pilot program was actually universal. It wasn't income restricted. We saw the reporting from that, and it was a very successful pilot by all accounts. And we talked to the people who administered it. We talked to the courts. Everybody had the same opinion of it, that it was a great option for tenants. We just thought that everyone agreed that tenants weren't getting the information about it sooner, that it existed, and that if they had it sooner, then that we would need more resources to make it work. So what this change really is it's codifying the program. However, it is not universal. It is still income tested. And so that is really the only change. We do hope that we're now able to bring on different providers, because with the program, we were only bringing on one provider, and we've allowed in the ordinance to be able to have multiple providers. So those are the few changes. It's just really scaling it up and making it a law.
So I've got to ask, we've covered right to counsel, which is sort of happening across the country. Here on the Appeal Live, I feel like I've talked to like 8 different jurisdictions across the country, and I know Alana Stiven has talked to equally many as well. This is happening in a lot of places, and the data on this is pretty striking. These programs tend to pay for themselves, because it's a lot less expensive to give someone a lawyer than it is to pay for them to be in the shelter system or to deal with a homelessness crisis. They tend to be popular with voters, majority bipartisan support for the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. You just mentioned like a few other reasons, this looming crisis that is quite particular to Denver, 1/3 of people being behind on rent, a lot of people being behind on rent. But you also voiced a concern about, whether you could get 6 votes on the city council and really feeling like you had to cross every T and dot every I to not have some procedural reason for this to not pass. So I'm kind of wondering, it sounds as if you're in a little bit of an uphill battle, and I can't quite wrap my head around who would be opposing this. Knowing the stats that I just sort of rattled off, who is opposing this and why?
That's always the question, like things that seem so common sense as a basic help to our constituents always have such big challenges or hurdles to overcome. And I think that the first excuse is always money. Where's the money for this going to come from? We don't have a permanent revenue stream, but we don't want to create a permanent revenue stream. Where are we going to get the money for this? Or how are we going to fund this in the long term? Or if everybody knows about it and everybody uses it, who's going to abuse it? Are the attorneys going to take advantage of it? those are some of like the most popular, I guess, pieces of resistance that I've experienced from my colleagues. And, there's never a good answer for some of those questions. A lot of those questions are often a cop out. You can't plan for a permanent revenue stream if you've never actually collected data on what you're doing. So I think that it's an important first step in spite of those concerns that many people have raised. Those questions can only be answered if we start the program and track the data.
So speaking of that data, I know you're building on an existing model that you just talked about having worked fairly well. And when we look at sort of sister cities, like Cleveland, for example, tried this and had a 93% reduction in evictions. 93% of evictions, were prevented during the first 6 months of their program. Other examples, New York, San Francisco, show the substantial cost savings that a jurisdiction can realize. What kind of metrics would you be tracking if you were to launch this program, and how much time would it take to get the data you need to figure out a permanent revenue stream?
I think that this coming year might be slightly an anomaly in how many people are going to need the eviction support, but I think we will collect some of the data that we're hoping to collect. We have not in our program, since it's universal, been collecting income data. So we don't know if there's a particular income bracket of folks that would use this resource. We would be tracking the people we turn away. If it's not universal, I think it's important to understand the clients we couldn't serve so that we can take them into consideration when we recalibrate. But case dispositions is probably the most critical data point. We want to know, what did we actually do? What does legal defense translate into for the client? And if we can somehow connect the clients that we serve through the eviction defense program to our longitudinal data that the housing department has, it would be nice to see the long-term implications of this investment, because you did raise an important point, that cost savings on downstream impacts. When we looked at other cities and calibrated our own data, we're estimating that for a $4 million investment in eviction legal defense, we will save at minimum $12 million down the line on some of those downstream impacts.
Wow. So with a potential $12 million in savings, I wanted, and also the fact you just mentioned of needing to track who gets turned away, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the income cap. Because as I understand it, there's currently an income cap built in of 80% of the median income. So a little less than $55,000 for one person, or $85,000 a year for a family of four. Why is the income? I mean, does the income cap make it likely this is going to pass? Like, why is it in there? And what do you say to people who are concerned that it could prevent a lot of people from getting the help they need?
That was a huge concern of mine. My intent when I started this was to actually make it universal. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that because of the many cost concerns that my colleagues had. So what we settled on was the 80% of the AMI. We had some folks who were pushing for 200% of the federal poverty line, which is so low. It's about $25,000 for an individual. So it would exclude anybody making over that. Meanwhile, we're the top gentrifying city in the country. And so we wanted to at least make sure that it was tied to a metric that is a little more dynamic than the federal poverty line, which is what they use for public defenders to be able to qualify for that. And so it is slightly, in the context that I'm working in, it is a win to be able to tie it to 80% AMI rather than the federal poverty level. But, my fear is that we are going to leave out a lot of people. If somebody can't pay their rent, it doesn't matter what their income taxes showed from the year prior that they made. They couldn't make enough money to pay their rent in that moment. And so to me, their income historically over the last year shouldn't matter. But the only way that I'm going to be able to prove to my colleagues that there is an appetite at income brackets higher than the 80% AMI is with data. And so, it was a compromise I had to make to help this get across the finish line. And I truly hope that in their recommendations to create this AMI income test, that they were genuine about their support.
So for folks who are watching this, who may be in Colorado, for Coloradoans who are watching this show and who are thinking, like, I don't want to wait till November. Like, great that this is on the ballot in November, but I really, really want some local legislator attention to keep a third of us from getting evicted. Right now, what is the next step in the timeline that they should know about? And what is the opportunity for people to get involved if they're interested?
Well, this is a big week for us. We've got housing things happening at our state legislature tonight. And on Wednesday, this will be in committee for city council. And so folks who are interested, who want to be supportive, I urge you to sign up for public comment to testify. You'll be able to do that, but you can always also write your council members, call your council members, engage with them on social media. Sometimes that is even more effective to get on the tweets and Twitter, and make sure that you're calling them out and letting them know you support this. That's very helpful in helping us generate that momentum that we need to make it a politically viable piece of legislation.
Well, Councilwoman Sedebaca, thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing so much detail about this, and for giving people a realistic sense of what can happen next. It's always a pleasure having you on here, and I hope to have another chance to talk with you again soon. Maybe you can come back and tell us about all the success that this bill has had.
Yes.
But I wish you the best of luck in the meantime.
Thank you so much, and I hope to come back and report on all the good things that happen here and with the data as we start collecting it.
Sounds good. So there you have it, folks. For those of you who've been following our right to counsel in eviction proceedings coverage, you are getting the sense now this is happening in so many different places. And Denver needs, to pay some urgent attention to this issue, because the numbers are staggering. 1 out of 3 renters are behind on rent right now. There is no Colorado eviction moratorium in place protecting people right now. It is only the federal eviction moratorium. And I have been saying on these shows that it expires in June. Well, folks, June is now just a matter of weeks away. The eviction cliff is coming. And it's not a minor policy issue. It is people's homes, livelihood, safety during a pandemic. It's the shelter over their kids' heads. It's their kids tied to a school district. It's a place where you can work from, or find a job from, or come home to after a double shift. It is everything. Home is everything. So we are proud to be covering these issues in Denver and across the country. But as you heard here in Denver, there's 2 shots for the right to counsel to pass. There is the possibility that Councilwoman Sedebaca will get the votes she needs to pass this locally, or it could be on the ballot in November. No matter which way it goes, it is an issue to attend to. And we're so glad to be able to cover it for you here on The Appeal Live. You can join us for more on this in other places and here. You can join us for this any day of the week. Thank you so much. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza.